Hey, how's it going? I think we all would agree that facing difficulties or even suffering is just a normal part of life. But really, when we think about it, we can really identify 4 or 5 reasons why we typically suffer. And the first is usually, we suffer because of the actions of others. Second reason is sometimes we suffer because of our own actions, our own mistakes that we make. A third reason we might face difficulty or suffer is because we try to do something right. We try to achieve something good, either for ourselves or for others. And then in the middle of that, we just face opposition. Now, a fourth reason we might face difficulty or experience suffering is because that's just the reality of the world in which we live. That's a reality of the human experience. Sometimes we just suffer because of how the world works. And then a final, very challenging concept to grasp is from a Christian perspective. Sometimes we suffer so that God's might be displayed, or that God's work in the world might be evident. Meaning we'll suffer or experience suffering so that God can show up in a big way and make a difference and correct what we see as something being wrong, or make right a situation where people are experiencing a lack of some sort or a suffering. Now, obviously, since I'm a Christian, I derive these principles from the Bible, and briefly, I would like to just expound on those from a scriptural standpoint. And to do that, I'm going to go to the story of Moses. Way back in Exodus, we read of him being born, and if we look at the scope of his life, we'll see at least 4 of these reasons he suffered or faced difficulty, and then we'll look at John chapter 9 for the final one. The Bible says that a new king arose in Egypt that didn't remember the life of Joseph before, and this king was threatened by the nation of Israel because their number was increasing, and he was afraid that they would rebel or align themselves with the enemies of Egypt and end up causing a problem for him in his reign. And the Bible says that as a result of that, he tried to heavily burden the Israelites or the Jews, and then eventually even tried to eradicate all of their male children. So here we have an example of the nation of Israel and even the family of Moses experiencing fairly incredible difficulty and even suffering because of the actions of someone else, and that being Pharaoh. And then later on, as Moses grew older, he witnessed an Egyptian putting a burden on an Israelite in an unjust way, and as a result, Moses ended up striking and killing the Egyptian. He was wanting in his own way to take control of the actions, not really considering God's plan or God's will, but he irrationally killed an Egyptian out of revenge or to try to somehow defend his other people. And because of that mistake, Moses' life was in danger, and he ended up having to flee his people and go out on the backside of the wilderness and live there for a really long time. So Moses really created a difficult situation for himself by not being patient and waiting on God to deliver the people. And then that brings us to another reason we mentioned. Later, God does come to Moses and say he wants to send him back into Egypt and use Moses to lead the people out of the nation of Israel. So Moses goes and he does that, and he faces insane difficulty wrestling with the Egyptians and Pharaoh, and all the plagues happen. And as Jesus sends him, this is interesting. As God sends Moses, this is interesting. He says that I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So God lets Moses know this is not going to be easy. This is going to be tough. We're kind of in for a fight here, Moses. But don't worry, I can handle it. I'll take care of it, and we will get those people out of Egypt. And that's what happened. But Moses faced insane challenges, suffering, difficulty, because he was trying to achieve God's will and do a right thing. Later on, several chapters later, after Moses, with God's help, led the nation of Israel out of Egypt, they move into the wilderness and they go for 3 days and they just can't find water. And God has to show up miraculously and intervene and cause bad water to be drinkable or inadequate water to be adequate. So, why was Moses facing that particular difficulty? Because that's just the reality of earth, right? Sometimes we go to places and there's no water. Sometimes natural events occur. And just sometimes our bodies break down. Just sometimes we face difficulty because that's just the reality in which we live. A final one I want to mention is over in John chapter 9, Jesus encounters a blind guy, and those around Jesus ask Jesus, did he sin to cause himself to be blind, or did his parents sin? And Jesus simply said, neither. Neither one of them sinned. This man is blind so that the power of God might be shown, or that God's might be displayed. Jesus then miraculously heals the man of his blindness, and God is given the glory for it, and Jesus is shown in that way to be, the God of the universe in human flesh. So that's a tough one for us to wrap our brain around, but sometimes conditions happen or are in place or are allowed to be in place under God's sovereignty so that he can show up and do miracles and glorify himself in front of men as a testimony to God's goodness, right? That's a tough one, but that's God's call, not ours. Now, this is an appropriate question, and my next video is going to address this. When we do face difficulty and challenges or even suffer from any of these various reasons, what should be our response? What's a biblical response to suffering? So that's what I'm going to talk about next. Talk to you again soon.